The courtroom was silent, everyone hanging on every word as the tension filled the room. Ethan Blake, one of the state's top defense attorneys, stood firm, arms crossed, a look of utter disdain in his eyes. The man in the chair before him, Marcus Thompson, was no ordinary client. Marcus was a well-dressed black man with a confident stance, yet something about him seemed to stir irritation in the attorney's gaze. Ethan's voice boomed, echoing through the courtroom. "I will not represent someone like him," he declared, his tone sharp and full of a prejudice he didn't bother to hide. Heads turned in shock. This wasn't the Ethan Blake everyone knew, the polished, controlled lawyer. But here he was openly rejecting a client in front of everyone. "I won't stand here and pretend this is worth my time," he added. The judge blinked in disbelief, unsure of what he was hearing. "Mr. Blake," she cautioned, "are you certain you understand the implications of what you're saying?" Ethan barely looked at her, waving his hand dismissively. Marcus looked calm, yet there was a glint in his eye. He leaned forward and cleared his throat. "Ethan," he began, cool and composed, "I think you should know who I am before you make any final decisions." Ethan scoffed, giving Marcus a look of mock curiosity. "And why is that?" he sneered. Marcus leaned in, his voice low but firm, sending chills through the room. "Because I'm Governor James Thompson's brother," he said. Ethan's face turned white as a ghost. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, and Ethan staggered back a step, clutching his briefcase as if he might just bolt for the door. He had just insulted the governor's brother in front of a judge, a full courtroom, and an entire jury. The room held its breath, waiting to see what Ethan would do next, but his face showed nothing but shock and regret. 3 weeks before that fateful day, Ethan Blake was sitting comfortably in his office, sipping his morning coffee as he looked over a list of new client requests. Business was booming for Ethan, a well-known lawyer who had defended some of the most influential people in the state. Ethan was sharp, confident, and no stranger to winning. In his mind, every case he took was a step toward greatness, and he only wanted clients who fit his idea of success. When his assistant, Laura, entered his office with a stack of files, she placed one in front of him with a hopeful look. "You'll want to look at this one, Mr. Blake," she said. "It's a high-profile case, and it could be your next big break." Ethan barely glanced at the file and frowned, noticing the name on it. "Marcus Thompson," he muttered. "Why would I take on a nobody like him?" Laura hesitated, surprised by his dismissive attitude. "Well, sir," she said, trying to explain, "he's connected, really connected, and he's facing a serious charge that could make or break his life." Ethan rolled his eyes, waving the file away. "I don't care who he's connected to. I'm not wasting my time on a client like him," he declared, already moving on to the next file. Laura opened her mouth to speak, but then closed it, not wanting to push her luck with her boss. Over the next few days, the news of Marcus Thompson's case spread like wildfire. Marcus had been wrongfully accused of a major crime, one that could ruin his future if he didn't have a strong defense. But each time Marcus's name came up, Ethan turned it down, refusing to even meet him. He prided himself on his reputation and didn't see any benefit in defending Marcus. To him, Marcus was just another person trying to get ahead, and he felt no obligation to help. But Marcus was no ordinary client. He knew that Ethan's refusal to meet him was more than just a professional decision. It was a sign of something deeper. So he decided to confront Ethan personally, walking straight into Ethan's office without an appointment. The assistant looked flustered as Marcus entered, and Ethan looked up, startled to see him there. "You must be Marcus," Ethan said coldly, barely looking up from his papers. Marcus smiled, undeterred by Ethan's frosty reception. "Yes, I am," he replied, "and I'd like to discuss my case." Ethan folded his arms, giving Marcus a dismissive glance. "I've already told my assistant that I'm not interested," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "There are plenty of other lawyers who would be happy to represent you. I'm not one of them." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "Do you even know why you don't want to represent me?" he asked quietly. Ethan didn't flinch. "I don't need to know. I choose my clients, and I've chosen not to work with you," he replied curtly. Marcus paused, his face calm but serious. "You may regret that choice, Mr. Blake," he said, but Ethan only smirked, unmoved by the warning. Days passed, and as the case gained more public attention, it became clear that Marcus was being targeted unfairly. The story behind the accusations against him was twisted and complex, But instead of backing down, Marcus continued to search for a lawyer willing to take his side. Laura, meanwhile, began to feel uncomfortable. She'd seen Ethan turn away clients before, but something about this case bothered her. One day, she decided to bring it up again. "Mr. Blake," she said, "are you sure you're making the right choice?" Ethan looked at her sharply. "I don't need you questioning my decisions, Laura," he replied. "If I wanted to take that case, I would have by now." But Laura wouldn't let it go. "Sir, what if he's innocent?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Ethan scoffed. "Innocent or guilty, it's not my concern. Let someone else waste their time," he said, his mind closed to the idea. Then came the day of the initial hearing, and Ethan found himself in the courtroom by pure coincidence, dealing with another case on the same docket. As he sat in his usual seat, he heard Marcus's name called, and he glanced over, surprised to see the man standing confidently, with no attorney by his side. The judge looked at Marcus, raising an eyebrow. "Mr. Thompson, I see you're here alone. Have you been unable to secure legal representation?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. It seems that certain lawyers find me unworthy of their time," he said, his tone calm but pointed. The judge looked at Ethan, giving him a thoughtful look. Ethan shifted in his seat, pretending not to notice, but he could feel her gaze boring into him. In a twist of fate, Marcus turned to Ethan, meeting his eyes with a calm, piercing stare. "Mr. Blake," he said clearly, "would you consider representing me now, seeing as you're already here?" Ethan felt the eyes of the entire courtroom on him, and he forced a laugh, waving Marcus off. "I've already told you, Mr. Thompson. I'm not interested," he replied, his voice cold and dismissive. The judge's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Blake," she said, "it is highly unusual for an attorney of your caliber to refuse a case under such circumstances. I would advise you to reconsider." Ethan felt his cheeks flush, but he shook his head, holding his ground. "With all due respect, Your Honor, my answer remains the same," he said stubbornly. And that's when Marcus dropped the bombshell that would change everything. "Perhaps you should know that I'm Governor James Thompson's brother," he said, his voice ringing out in the hushed courtroom. Ethan's face drained of color, his shock visible to everyone in the room. He had just rejected the governor's brother in a public courtroom, displaying his prejudice for all to see. He looked around, seeing the judge's frown, the jury's disapproval, and the shocked faces of the spectators. Ethan swallowed, suddenly uncertain as he stood there, knowing he'd just made a terrible mistake. The courtroom was buzzing with murmurs, and Ethan could feel every pair of eyes glued to him, each one a reminder of the colossal mistake he had just made. The judge banged her gavel, calling the court to order, but the hum of whispers and sideways glances continued. She eyed Ethan with a mix of disbelief and stern disapproval. Ethan's face burned, and he looked down, barely able to meet Marcus's calm, knowing gaze. "Mr. Blake," the judge's voice broke the silence again. "Considering Mr. Thompson's unique status, are you sure you want to stand by your decision not to represent him?" Ethan hesitated, gripping his briefcase as if it might shield him from the weight of what he had just done. Every instinct told him to backtrack, to somehow salvage the situation. But his pride dug in. He had already shown his true colors, and to admit a mistake now would only deepen his humiliation. Swallowing his pride, Ethan forced himself to speak, his voice strained but firm. "Your Honor," he began, "my decision stands. I have no interest in taking this case, and I respectfully decline." As soon as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a mistake, but it was too late. The judge's face hardened, and Marcus's faint smirk was impossible to ignore. "Very well," the judge replied coldly, her gaze shifting to Marcus. "Mr. Thompson, we will do everything in our power to ensure you receive fair representation." Marcus nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor," he replied, casting one last look at Ethan. "I appreciate the court's commitment to justice." Ethan walked out of the courtroom, feeling the weight of his choice settle around him like a lead blanket. His confidence had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing sense of regret. By the time he reached his office, his assistant Laura was already waiting for him, her face a mixture of concern and disappointment. "Mr. Blake," she said carefully, "you know who he is now, right? Why didn't you?" Ethan cut her off, raising a hand. "Enough, Laura," he snapped, though his voice lacked its usual sharpness. He sank into his chair, rubbing his temples. "I've made my decision, and there's nothing more to discuss." But Laura didn't back down. "With respect, sir, this could hurt your career. The whole courtroom saw what happened. You know the governor's influence. If he decides to take this personally, it could mean trouble." Ethan scowled, annoyed that she dared question him. Yet, beneath his irritation, a seed of doubt had taken root. What if Laura was right? He had never imagined that the man he'd dismissed so quickly had connections that could make or break his career. And now, that man's face was plastered all over the news, with every headline highlighting the fact that he was the governor's brother facing false accusations. Accusations that Ethan had scoffed at without even considering. The next morning, Ethan awoke to a barrage of messages. His phone buzzed nonstop, and as he scrolled through, he saw his name featured in article after article. Reporters had somehow gotten wind of his public refusal to represent Marcus, and the headlines were brutal. Top lawyer rejects governor's brother in court. Prejudice exposed. Ethan Blake's shocking refusal. I won't defend him. Racial bias at play. Panic seized him as he read through each article, feeling the impact of his actions sinking in. He had never expected this level of backlash. His social media accounts were flooded with comments, some from supporters, but many more from critics calling him out, demanding an explanation for his behavior. The comments were unrelenting. "Can't believe a lawyer like him would do this. Racism has no place in our justice system. This guy needs to answer for his actions." Ethan's hands shook as he shut off his phone, feeling his carefully built reputation crumbling around him. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, the best lawyer money could buy. But now, he felt cornered, exposed in a way he had never anticipated. In a desperate attempt to do damage control, he called a press conference, hoping to clear his name and set the record straight. He had no intention of admitting fault, but he figured he could spin the situation to make himself appear above the accusations. Standing at the podium in front of flashing cameras, Ethan took a deep breath and began his statement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, his voice steady, "I understand there has been some misunderstanding regarding my recent actions in court. I want to assure everyone that my decision to decline Mr. Thompson's case had nothing to do with prejudice." Reporters' hands shot up, their questions coming fast and loud. "Mr. Blake, are you suggesting that turning down the governor's brother was purely a business decision? How do you respond to the claims that this reflects a larger issue in the legal system? Do you regret your decision?" Ethan plastered on a practiced smile, but inside, he was reeling. "As I always maintained, I reserve the right to choose cases based on my professional discretion," he said, his tone cool but tense. "This case simply did not align with my current focus." But even as he spoke, he could see the skepticism in the reporters' eyes, the judgment in their questions. They weren't buying it, and deep down, neither was he. When the press conference ended, Ethan left the building feeling more isolated than ever. The crowd outside the courthouse had gathered, some holding signs condemning racial prejudice in the justice system, others calling for Ethan's resignation. He hurried past them, but the voices of protest followed him, echoing in his mind long after he had shut himself in his office. Back at his desk, he sat staring at his reflection in the dark screen of his computer, feeling a mix of anger and fear. He had spent years building his career, establishing himself as a respected attorney. Yet here he was, all of it unraveling over one case he had turned away. As the days went by, the fallout continued. Colleagues distanced themselves, his phone calls went unanswered, and clients began to withdraw from his services, one after another. Even the firms he partnered with seemed to be quietly cutting ties, leaving him increasingly isolated. One evening, as he sat in his dimly lit office, exhausted and defeated, a knock on the door startled him. He looked up to see Marcus Thompson standing there, his face calm, but resolute. "Ethan," Marcus said, stepping into the office, "I didn't come here to gloat. I came here to give you one more chance to do the right thing." Ethan's face flushed with anger, but a flicker of desperation held him back from lashing out. "Why would you even bother?" he asked, his voice low. "You could have any lawyer now. You don't need me." Marcus regarded him steadily, his expression unchanging. "You're right, I don't need you," he said. "But you need to prove that justice isn't just for people who look like you. Maybe I'm giving you one last chance because I believe even someone like you can learn. If you turn me down again, though, know that I won't come back." The weight of Marcus's words settled heavily on Ethan's shoulders. He knew that Marcus was right. This was his last chance to redeem himself, to show the world he was more than the arrogant, prejudiced lawyer they saw him as. But was he brave enough to admit he had been wrong? Could he set aside his pride and finally do the right thing? Ethan's silence filled the room, and Marcus turned to leave, shaking his head slightly as if already disappointed by the answer he expected. But just as he reached the door, Ethan's voice cut through the air, hesitant but determined. "Wait," Ethan said, standing up, his face tense with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I'll take your case, Marcus, but don't expect me to apologize. I'm doing this for my own reasons." Marcus paused, a small smile playing on his lips. "You don't need to apologize to me," he replied. "The apology is for yourself." As Marcus walked out, leaving Ethan alone in the quiet of his office, Ethan felt the first real crack in the walls he had built around himself. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew that for the first time in his career, he would have to confront more than just his client's innocence or guilt. He would have to confront himself. As the reality of his decision sank in, Ethan felt an unsettling combination of fear and determination. He had just made a promise that would change everything. Representing Marcus meant he'd have to confront his own biases, and more than that, he'd have to stand up against the tidal wave of judgment waiting for him. His career was in tatters, his reputation bruised beyond recognition. This case was now his only shot at redemption. The next day, Ethan called Laura into his office. She entered cautiously, glancing at him with a hint of surprise when he began discussing Marcus's case with her in earnest. "I need every detail on this case. Pull the files, look through the police reports, and find anything that can work in our favor," he instructed, his voice a mix of authority and nervousness. Laura, always loyal, but never blind to his flaws, simply nodded. As they dove into the case, the details began to paint a disturbing picture. Marcus had been accused of theft, stealing from a prominent businessman's warehouse, but the evidence was flimsy at best. The supposed eyewitness had been unable to give a consistent account, and the surveillance footage showed a figure whose features were barely discernible in the dim light. It seemed more and more like Marcus had been singled out not because he'd committed a crime, but because he'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Hours turned into days as Ethan pored over the case files, and he found himself becoming increasingly outraged. This case wasn't just about one man. It was a glimpse into how people like Marcus could be condemned without evidence, written off because of prejudices deeply embedded in the system. Ethan's usual cynicism started to wane, replaced by a growing sense of responsibility. A week later, Ethan and Marcus sat across from each other in Ethan's office. Marcus looked calm, almost serene, but Ethan could feel the tension in the air. "So," Marcus said, breaking the silence, "are you ready for what's coming?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I think so," he replied, though he wasn't entirely sure. "The evidence against you is weak, but we're up against a lot. Public opinion is already against you." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "I know how this works, Ethan. People see what they want to see. And right now, they want to see me as guilty. But I believe in truth. And I believe that maybe, just maybe, you're ready to fight for it." Ethan looked down, avoiding Marcus's gaze. He still couldn't shake his doubts. But he nodded, committing to the challenge. "I'll do my best." Over the next several days, Ethan and Laura worked tirelessly, building a defense that could challenge the prosecution's weak claims. They pored over every witness statement, every piece of evidence, crafting questions that would force the truth out in court. Yet, the deeper they dug, the more they encountered the silent barriers of prejudice. Small, seemingly insignificant details in the police reports, biased language in the eyewitness accounts, and glaring gaps in the investigation that had somehow been overlooked. One evening, after yet another long day of preparation, Laura approached Ethan with a troubled expression. "There's something you should know," she began, handing him a document she'd uncovered. Ethan scanned the page, his frown deepening as he read the officer's report detailing Marcus's arrest. The officer mentioned suspicious behavior. Ethan muttered, "But there's no description of what Marcus was actually doing to warrant that label." "Exactly," Laura replied. "It's a vague, sweeping term they're using to justify pulling him in. No specifics, no evidence, just assumptions." Ethan's grip on the document tightened. He was beginning to see how quickly assumptions could replace facts, and it made his blood boil. He was no stranger to manipulative tactics in the courtroom, but this felt different. This wasn't about winning a case or manipulating a jury. This was about fighting against an injustice that he had never truly understood until now. Finally, the day of the pretrial hearing arrived, and Ethan walked into the courthouse with Marcus by his side. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters, their cameras flashing as Ethan and Marcus made their way through the crowd. The public interest in the case had only grown, with the media painting it as a story of a controversial lawyer defending a man many believed to be guilty. Ethan could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but he kept his focus on Marcus, who walked with quiet dignity. Inside, the hearing was packed. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named James Porter, was known for his relentless pursuit of convictions, and he wasted no time in painting Marcus as a threat to society. Porter leaned into the lack of an alibi, the suspicious behavior Marcus had supposedly exhibited, and the vague but damning eyewitness account. Ethan listened intently, his mind racing as Porter twisted the flimsy evidence into something that sounded almost convincing. When it was finally his turn, he rose slowly, clearing his throat before beginning. "Your Honor," he addressed the judge, "we've heard a lot of accusations today, but let's look at the facts. There is no solid evidence linking my client to this crime. The surveillance footage is inconclusive. The eyewitness couldn't even describe the alleged perpetrator accurately, and there's no motive for my client to have committed this crime. What we have is a case built on assumptions." The judge listened carefully, her expression unreadable, but Ethan could sense a shift in the room. He had poked holes in the prosecution's case, forcing everyone to confront the possibility that Marcus was innocent. After the hearing, as they exited the courthouse, a reporter pushed through the crowd and shoved a microphone in Ethan's face. "Mr. Blake, do you honestly believe your client is innocent?" she asked, her tone laced with skepticism. Ethan paused, glancing at Marcus before answering. "Yes," he said firmly. "I believe in justice, and I believe that everyone deserves a fair chance to prove their innocence." As they walked away, Ethan felt a strange sense of pride. For the first time in his career, he wasn't just fighting for a win. He was fighting for something much bigger. But the challenges were far from over. The community was divided, with some rallying behind Marcus, while others continued to condemn him. Ethan's own life had changed dramatically. He had lost clients, received hateful messages, and even had colleagues distance themselves from him. Late one night, after another exhausting day, Ethan sat alone in his office, staring at a photograph of his father, a stern, no-nonsense man who had always valued success above all else. Growing up, Ethan had been taught that winning was everything, that losing was a sign of weakness. But now, he wondered if his father had been wrong. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Laura, accompanied by a link to a news article. Ethan opened it, his heart sinking as he read the headline. "Governor's brother accused in high-profile case threatens lawyer's career. Ethan Blake faces pressure from all sides." The article detailed how some politicians and community leaders were calling for Ethan's disbarment, claiming that his defense of Marcus was an affront to justice. It seemed that no matter how hard he fought, the walls were closing in around him. Just then, there was a knock at his office door. He looked up, surprised to see Marcus standing there, his expression unreadable. "Couldn't sleep," Marcus said simply, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Thought you might need someone to talk to." Ethan sighed, grateful for the unexpected company. "I never thought it would get this bad," he admitted. "I knew it would be tough, but I didn't realize just how many people would want me to fail." Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "That's what happens when you challenge people's beliefs. You're asking them to see something they've spent their whole lives ignoring. It's easier for them to hate you than to question themselves." Ethan looked away, ashamed of how close he had come to being one of those people. He had once been just like them, comfortable in his own privilege, dismissing people like Marcus without a second thought. But now, he understood what was at stake, and he was determined to see it through. As they sat in silence, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but he knew he couldn't back down. This case had become more than just a defense. It was a fight for justice, a chance to make amends for his own mistakes. The calm was shattered, however, by the shrill ring of his phone. He answered it, his heart sinking as he listened to the voice on the other end. "Mr. Blake," the voice said urgently, "we have a problem. One of the key witnesses in the case was just found." The line went dead, and Ethan's blood ran cold. This witness had been crucial to their defense, a glimmer of hope in an otherwise uncertain case. And now, they were gone. The silence in Ethan's office was heavy, the tension almost suffocating. Ethan's hand trembled as he held the phone, the abrupt end of the call ringing in his ears. Marcus looked at him, his brow furrowing as he sensed something was wrong. "What happened?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan slowly lowered the phone, struggling to collect his thoughts. "One of our key witnesses. They're gone. They were found under mysterious circumstances." He forced the words out, his heart racing. Marcus's face went pale, and he closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. "So that's it? They're just gone. No one saw anything. No one saying anything." Ethan shook his head, a knot forming in his stomach. This witness was essential to their case, someone who had been able to shed light on what happened the night of the alleged theft. Without their testimony, the fragile defense they'd painstakingly built over the past weeks would crumble. "I'm going to call in every favor I've got," Ethan said, more to himself than to Marcus. "I'll find out what happened to them, and I'll make sure their statement gets into that courtroom one way or another." Marcus watched Ethan, his expression softening with a mix of admiration and gratitude. "You don't have to do this, you know," he murmured. "Not everyone would stick their neck out like this, especially for someone like me." Ethan felt a pang of guilt as he remembered how he once seen Marcus as little more than a burden, a case he hadn't wanted to touch, but now he was determined to prove his loyalty and redeem himself. "It's too late to turn back now," Ethan said, his voice filled with conviction. "We're in this together, and I'm not going to let you down." The next few days were a blur of activity. Ethan called every contact he had in law enforcement, political circles, and even some of his former clients who still had ties to the justice system. He pushed, pulled, and pressured, searching for answers about the witness's disappearance. But each lead ended in a dead end, each source only giving him vague reassurances or outright refusals to help. Meanwhile, the prosecution had seized on the absence of the witness, gleefully painting it as a sign that Marcus's criminal associates were interfering with the case. They were working overtime to turn public opinion further against him, flooding the media with stories that cast him in the worst possible light. One evening, after another fruitless day of chasing down leads, Ethan collapsed onto his office couch, feeling utterly defeated. He had promised Marcus that he would find a way to bring justice, but the obstacle seemed insurmountable. Just when he felt like giving up, his phone buzzed. It was Laura. "Ethan, I found something," she said, her voice urgent. Ethan bolted upright, a spark of hope igniting within him. "What is it?" "It's about the lead detective on Marcus's case, Detective Barnes. I dug into his background, and there's something strange. He's been involved in several cases over the years where black defendants were either given harsher sentences or had their cases mysteriously mishandled." Ethan's pulse quickened. "You think he might be trying to manipulate this case too?" "It's more than that," Laura replied. "I found a pattern. Every time Barnes was on a case with a black defendant, certain pieces of evidence would go missing. Witnesses would back out, or the defendants would be pressured into taking plea deals." Ethan's mind raced as he processed this information. Detective Barnes wasn't just biased, he was systematically sabotaging cases. This could change everything. Ethan said, barely able to contain his excitement. "If we can prove this, we could expose Barnes and get Marcus's case thrown out." The next day, armed with Laura's findings, Ethan arranged a meeting with the judge presiding over the case. He presented the information about Detective Barnes, detailing the pattern of discrimination and evidence tampering. The judge listened carefully, her expression growing more serious as Ethan laid out the facts. "This is a serious accusation, Mr. Blake," she said, her voice firm. "If what you're saying is true, it could have far-reaching implications not only for your client's case, but for others as well. I'll need concrete evidence before I can take any action." Ethan nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. "I'll get you the evidence," he promised. "Just give me a little more time." The judge agreed to delay the trial, giving Ethan a brief window to dig deeper into Detective Barnes's past. It was a slim chance, but it was all he had. Over the next week, Ethan and Laura worked tirelessly, scouring through case files, talking to people who had worked with Barnes, and reaching out to anyone who might have insight into his methods. They hit roadblock after roadblock, but eventually they managed to uncover something crucial. A former police officer who had worked alongside Barnes and had witnessed his misconduct firsthand. This former officer, a man named Phil Sanders, had left the force years ago, disillusioned by the corruption he had seen. He agreed to meet with Ethan and share what he knew, but only on the condition that his identity would be protected. Sitting in a dimly lit coffee shop, Phil recounted his experiences with Barnes, describing how the detective would subtly manipulate evidence, intimidate witnesses, and bend the rules to ensure convictions against black defendants. He has a way of making things disappear, Phil said, his voice low. He's careful, doesn't leave a trail, but I saw him do it enough times to know what he's about. Ethan listened intently, feeling a mix of anger and determination. This was the break they needed. With Phil's testimony, they could begin to unravel the web of corruption surrounding Barnes and expose the truth. As Ethan prepared to leave, Phil grabbed his arm, his expression serious. "Be careful, Ethan," he warned. "Barnes isn't the kind of man who'll just let this slide. If he finds out you're onto him, he won't hesitate to come after you." Ethan nodded, his resolve unshaken. "Thank you, Phil. We'll be careful." With this new testimony, Ethan returned to the judge, presenting Phil's account as evidence of Barnes's misconduct. The judge listened, her face a mask of concentration, and finally nodded. "I'll allow this testimony to be used in court," she said. "But I'll be watching closely. Mr. Blake, I expect you to handle this responsibly." Ethan left the courthouse that day feeling a renewed sense of hope. For the first time since he had taken on Marcus's case, he felt like they had a real chance at winning. But the victory was short-lived. The following morning, Ethan received a call from Laura, her voice frantic. "Ethan, there's something you need to know," she said, her words coming out in a rush. "Phil Sanders. He's missing. I tried calling him to go over his testimony, but no one's seen him since yesterday." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Phil had warned him that Barnes wouldn't take kindly to being exposed, but he hadn't expected him to act so quickly or so ruthlessly. As he hung up the phone, Ethan knew that they were in more danger than ever. Barnes was onto them, and he was willing to do whatever it took to protect his secrets. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about standing up to a system that had failed too many people for too long. He would fight this, no matter the cost. But as he turned back to his case files, a knock sounded at his office door. Ethan opened it to find two stern-faced police officers standing in the doorway, their hands resting on their holsters. "Mr. Blake," one of them said, his tone cold, "you're under investigation for tampering with a witness." Ethan's heart sank as he realized just how far Barnes was willing to go. He was being framed, his reputation once again on the line. But this time, he wasn't going down without a fight. The police officers didn't waste any time. They cuffed Ethan, their faces impassive, as they led him out of his office and down the hallway, past the astonished stares of his co-workers. Ethan's mind was racing, trying to process how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. Only a day ago, he felt hope, real hope, for Marcus's case. Now he was the one facing charges. Outside, the cool air stung his face as he was escorted into the back of a squad car. The officers remained silent, and Ethan could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew this wasn't just about him. Detective Barnes was sending a message. He wasn't afraid to go after anyone who challenged his authority. At the station, Ethan was fingerprinted and photographed, the harsh fluorescent lights making him feel exposed and vulnerable. He'd spent years on this side of the law, defending clients and fighting for justice. But now he was on the other side, and it felt surreal. After what felt like hours, he was led into a small, windowless interrogation room. He was left alone, his hands still cuffed, as the clock on the wall ticked loudly. He knew they wanted him to feel isolated, to break him down before the questioning began. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, reminding himself that he wasn't going to let Barnes win. Finally, the door opened, and a detective walked in. Someone he didn't recognize. The man sat down across from him, his gaze cold and calculating. "Ethan Blake," the detective began, flipping through a file on the table. "You're being investigated for tampering with a witness in an ongoing case. Seems you've been playing fast and loose with the law, Mr. Blake." Ethan held his gaze, refusing to let the intimidation tactics affect him. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied calmly. "I'm doing my job, defending my client against false accusations." The detective smirked. "Your client? You mean Marcus Langston?" He leaned forward, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Interesting choice, Mr. Blake. Not exactly your usual type of client, is he?" Ethan clenched his jaw, recognizing the unspoken insinuation. "My client is innocent," he said firmly, "and I'll do whatever it takes to prove it." The detective's smirk faded, replaced by a look of annoyance. "Well, here's the thing," he said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "We have evidence that you coerced a witness into testifying in your client's favor. Witness tampering is a serious offense, Mr. Blake. You could lose your license. Or worse. Ethan felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. This is a setup, he replied, his voice steady. I've done nothing wrong. Detective Barnes is behind this, and we both know it. The detective raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. Detective Barnes, I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Blake, but Detective Barnes is a respected officer. He's dedicated his career to upholding the law. Ethan almost laughed at the irony. Right, I'm sure he's very dedicated, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Dedicated enough to cover up evidence and intimidate witnesses, apparently. The detective's expression hardened. Careful, Mr. Blake. Those are serious accusations. Unless you have proof, I suggest you stop digging yourself into a deeper hole. Ethan leaned back, meeting the detective's gaze defiantly. Then arrest me, he challenged. But know that this isn't going away. I'll fight this, and I'll expose Barnes for what he really is. The detective didn't respond, instead, standing up and gathering his papers. Enjoy your stay, Mr. Blake, he said coolly. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other. With that, he left the room, leaving Ethan alone once again. The walls seemed to close in on him, and for a moment, he felt a flicker of doubt. But he quickly pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to doubt himself now. Marcus was counting on him, and he wasn't about to let Detective Barnes or anyone else derail their fight for justice. Hours later, he was released on bail, thanks to Laura's quick intervention. As he stepped out of the police station, she was waiting for him, her expression a mix of relief and worry. You okay? She asked, reaching out to steady him as he stumbled slightly. Ethan nodded, though he felt exhausted, both physically and mentally. Barely, he admitted, but I'm not giving up. Barnes thinks he can scare me off, but he's wrong. Laura gave him a small smile. Good, because I have some news. I did a little more digging, and I found something interesting about Barnes's financial records. There's a pattern of deposits. Large, unexplained deposits that don't match his salary. Ethan's eyes widened. You think he's taking bribes? Laura nodded. It's possible. I can't say for sure without more evidence, but it's definitely suspicious. If we can prove it, it could blow his whole operation wide open. Ethan felt a renewed sense of hope. Then that's our next move. We expose Barnes for what he really is. They spent the next few days working around the clock, tracing every lead they could find on Barnes's financial activities. It was tedious work, and every time they hit a dead end, Ethan felt his frustration grow. But Laura's determination kept him going, and together, they began to piece together a web of corruption that reached far beyond Marcus's case. As they uncovered more details, they realized that Barnes had been involved in a network of shady deals, using his position to manipulate cases and secure convictions in exchange for payouts from wealthy clients who wanted certain outcomes. The more they dug, the clearer it became that Marcus's case was just one of many, and that Barnes would do whatever it took to keep his operation running. But then, just as they were about to compile their findings and present them to the judge, Ethan received a call in the middle of the night. It was Marcus. Ethan, he said, his voice shaking. They're coming after me. I don't know who, but I just got a warning. Someone told me I need to drop the case. Or else. Ethan's heart pounded as he listened. He knew the stakes were high, but he hadn't expected Barnes to go after Marcus directly. Stay calm, Marcus, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Don't do anything rash. We're so close to bringing Barnes down, but we have to be careful. Marcus was silent for a moment before he spoke again. Ethan, what if they're right? What if I'm just making things worse for myself by fighting this? Ethan's heart broke as he heard the fear and uncertainty in Marcus's voice. He knew the toll this case had taken on him, the way it had stripped him of his confidence and left him questioning everything. Listen to me, Marcus, he said firmly. You're not alone in this. We're going to fight this together, and we're going to win. Barnes is scared because he knows we're getting close to the truth. Don't let him intimidate you. Marcus took a shaky breath. All right, I trust you, Ethan. Just, please don't let me down. Ethan clenched his fist, a surge of determination flooding through him. I won't. We're in this until the end. But as he hung up, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control faster than he could manage. He glanced at the files spread across his desk, the evidence they'd painstakingly gathered against Barnes. They were so close to the truth, but they were also running out of time. As he sat alone in his office, a plan began to form in his mind. If Barnes was willing to go to such lengths to protect his secrets, then maybe it was time to play him at his own game. Ethan picked up his phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. It was a risk, but he was done playing by Barnes' rules. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "This is Detective Jones." Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Detective Jones, this is Ethan Blake. I have a proposition for you. It involves bringing down Barnes, and I think it's something you'll want to hear." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Ethan wondered if he'd made a mistake. But then Detective Jones replied, his voice low and serious. "Meet me tomorrow night, and make sure no one follows you." Ethan hung up, a thrill of anticipation coursing through him. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for sure. He was ready to face whatever came next. Ethan barely slept that night, his mind buzzing with anticipation and anxiety. Partnering with Detective Jones was a calculated risk. Jones had a reputation for being tough and incorruptible, the kind of cop who went after the bad guys with a relentless focus. If there was anyone who could help him bring down Barnes, it was Jones. But it also meant involving someone else in a game that was already dangerous. The next evening, Ethan made his way to the small, out-of-the-way diner where he'd agreed to meet Jones. It was the kind of place where people didn't ask questions, and everyone was too busy with their own problems to notice a quiet exchange between two men in the corner booth. Ethan scanned the room, and there he was, Detective Jones, sitting alone, sipping a cup of black coffee, his eyes focused on the door. As soon as Jones saw Ethan, he gave a small nod. Ethan walked over, sliding into the booth across from him. They sat in silence for a moment, each sizing the other up. Jones had a rugged look, his face weathered from years on the force, with eyes that seemed to see right through any pretense. "What do you have on Barnes?" Jones finally asked, his voice low but direct. Ethan pulled out a small folder from his bag, laying it on the table between them. "Enough to show he's been taking bribes and manipulating cases. We've tracked deposits that don't match his salary, and we have a few witnesses who are willing to talk if they feel protected." Jones raised an eyebrow, glancing down at the folder. "And you're willing to go up against Barnes? That man's got connections. He's been in this game a long time." Ethan met his gaze, unwavering. "I don't have a choice. Barnes is ruining lives, and he's threatened both my client and me. He'll stop at nothing to keep his operation going." Jones leaned back, tapping his fingers on the table thoughtfully. "I've been watching Barnes for years. The man's slippery, always one step ahead, covering his tracks." He looked Ethan squarely in the eye. "But I'll help you on one condition." Ethan nodded, leaning in. "Name it." Jones's expression grew serious. "You follow my lead. I know the people who can turn the heat up on Barnes. But one wrong move, and he'll catch wind of this. If we're going to bring him down, we need to be smart and quiet." Ethan nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. "Deal. Whatever it takes to end this." Jones slid the folder back across the table. "Good. First things first, we need to protect your witnesses. Once we have statements from them, we'll have enough leverage to push this forward." Ethan's phone buzzed just then. He checked the screen and saw it was Laura. "Sorry, I need to take this," he said, excusing himself as he stepped outside. "Ethan." Laura's voice was shaky, and immediately his heart sank. "Something's happened. Marcus is missing." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean missing?" "His sister said he left their house this morning and hasn't been back since. No one's heard from him, and his phone's going straight to voicemail." Ethan's mind raced. Had Barnes gotten to him? Was Marcus in danger? "All right, I'll be there soon," he said, hanging up and rushing back into the diner to inform Jones. "Barnes might have made his move," Ethan said urgently. "Marcus, my client, he's missing." Jones's expression darkened. "Then we don't have time to waste. I'll put out an APB. But if Barnes has him, we'll need more than just paperwork to get him back." The weight of the situation pressed down on Ethan as he realized that they were no longer just fighting a legal battle. Now Marcus's life was at stake. Ethan's heart pounded as he and Detective Jones raced against time. The search for Marcus intensified, with officers combing through every possible lead. The stakes had risen from a courtroom showdown to a life-or-death rescue, and Ethan knew every second counted. Days passed with little progress. each hour stretching Ethan's nerves thinner. Just as hope began to fade, a break came. A witness, someone who'd seen Marcus being escorted into a building on the outskirts of town, came forward anonymously. With this information, Jones and a small team prepared to storm the location. Ethan insisted on going with them, determined to see this through. As they approached the building, the tension was palpable. Officers surrounded the perimeter, ready for anything. Jones signaled, and they moved in, weapons drawn. Inside, the place was eerily quiet, the air thick with dust and tension. Room by room, they searched, finally finding Marcus bound in a dimly lit back room, disoriented but alive. Ethan ran to him, relieved beyond words. As the officers escorted Marcus out, they found Barnes in a hidden office, furiously trying to erase his digital records. He was arrested on the spot, his carefully constructed world of corruption crumbling around him. With Barnes facing charges of kidnapping, bribery, and obstruction of justice, the entire city watched the trial unfold. His powerful connections couldn't shield him anymore. Marcus bravely testified, detailing the threats Barnes had made against him and the intimidation he'd suffered. His story resonated with the jury, who delivered a swift, damning verdict. In the aftermath, Marcus thanked Ethan for standing by him when no one else would. Ethan, too, felt changed, having witnessed firsthand the courage it took to challenge systemic injustice. News of the trial made waves, sparking conversations about fairness, equality, and the responsibility of those in power. The experience taught Ethan that the law could be a powerful tool for justice, but only when wielded with integrity. His relationship with his clients deepened, his practice flourished, and he became a figure of hope for people who often felt voiceless. But more than anything, he'd made a difference. And for Ethan, that was worth every battle fought, every risk taken.